So, the next episode of Guild Wars 2's Icebrew Saga has now released. In this video, I'm going to give you guys my first impressions, a rundown of what's going on there. There will be spoilers. I'm going to canvas pretty much everything here. But just to be clear, this is my first impressions, really, coming out of my first playthrough just last night. So I'll likely have missed a lot of details. These patches are very big with all kinds of hidden treats in them. So if you think I've got something wrong or there's some more context, feel free to leave a comment. I do want to be clear, this is like my first hands-on, and we'll see what we think about it as we go forwards. Now, starting off with the patch notes, normally I would dedicate a video to just the notes themselves, but I'm not doing that here because there's really nothing to say. I mean, some Ranger Bird nerfs, a ton of gem store stuff, and the Black Lion Trading Company building in Lion's Arch has changed a bit, which, let's face it, is pretty much more gem store stuff. So really not much going on there. Let's just deal with the map, the story, and what it was like to play. So starting with one big topic, and that is the fact that this release has no voiceover. I'm in an interesting situation here where the video I'm making right now I think will have worth over many, many years, because eventually they are going to come back and add voices to this release. So what I'm experiencing and what you can experience right here today if you're getting to this video just as it's been uploaded is kind of only going to be there for a while and then it'll be lost. So for posterity's sake, here's what they did. There's no dialogue voiceover almost in the whole patch. Whenever you interact with a character and a bubble would appear, or as just a long conversation is playing out and, you know, bubbles are firing, the character won't speak the line, but there will be a small generic noise or something to that effect, a grunt or something, letting you know that a new queue has fallen up. Now, I actually think that that's something that had been going on with Guild Wars 2 for years, but was very, like, subdued and maybe hadn't been leaned into much in recent years at all. I don't think it adds too much, but it was an interesting experience. Actually, it reminded me a bit of playing games like The Sims, where they are speaking a language, but it's meant to be uninterpretable. And you kind of get a bit of that feeling there here too. There is also the opportunity to spam interact on various characters, and they'll play like generic full voice cued lines. Like the kinds of lines that would be generically played anywhere in the game, such as you interact with a Skrit and they say, "You bring me something?" You know, you could hear that anywhere. There aren't actually any Skrit in this patch, but that's the example that first springs to mind. So aside from that, there was also one voiced line, as far as I can see, in the whole patch. I don't know how the devs had this one line on hand. Maybe it had been recorded for a previous episode and now been pulled forward or something, but in what is essentially the one main big cutscene in this entire release, there is a single line coming from Ryland that does kind of pay off in a fun way. It's sort of like when you're watching a black and white movie like Schindler's List and all of a sudden you see a little girl's coat is in red and you're like, oh, color exists, I remember this, and it accentuates the moment. There's kind of one voiced line that does something like that. Overall, I would say that this was a harder patch to enjoy with the no voice acting. In a previous video, I did kind of anticipate that and said I expected it to be challenging, but would also feel a little bit more like Guild Wars 1. And in general, it kind of fell exactly in my expectations. The one thing I didn't anticipate was that the real reason it was so hard was because of split attention. Like, if I'm reading the chat, first, I have to decide, am I going to read the overworld bubbles, which disappear, and you don't know when they're going to disappear, because there is no voice acting to cue you into when the sentence would end, and then the bubble would disappear. So do you do that, or do you choose to read from the chat box, which you can have in the very bottom left of your screen, or in the very top left of your screen? And in either situation, that means your eyes are always going to be drawn off to some remote corner. You don't really get to see the environments you're traveling through. Like, when I first joined the map, I found it was a real struggle to like get a sense of where I was, what the Verdant Cascades looked like 250 years in the future, because all my time was like fixated on this bit of UI in the corner. And in a lot of the footage you're looking at here, I've expanded the UI to be as big as possible, just in a hope that that will be rectified in some way, but it really didn't work too much. I don't remember Guild Wars 1 having such problems with that. Maybe that's because after factions they did those big, you know, dialogue bubbles in the middle of the screen. I was always kind of excited to play a patch with no voice acting, and I know you could always have simulated this by dragging the audio slider down, but I was kind of interested in doing it just because I figured it would reveal and kind of deconstruct exactly where a lot of the weight of the story comes from, and I definitely did have that experience playing this. Like, as you go through, you'll realize that most of the lines of dialogue the devs have, at least in this patch, are very, like, bluntly written, very surface level. They're not really trying to do anything that interesting. And where they really come alive is in the voice direction. And it's not until you unpackage the two and you realize just how much work really and how much flavor and enjoyment of following this story comes from listening to the VA and the kind of twist that they put on the delivery of the lines. Let's change gears now and talk a little bit about the patch in general and the new map, how it functions. So I was expecting this to feel a lot like either the Silver Wastes or World vs. World, possibly some kind of matchup of the two. I think the community is always clamoring and likes to draw comparisons to the Silver Wastes because so many people feel that it was so well designed, and so obviously ArenaNet must be trying to recapture that in some way. But to tell you the truth, in the end, I didn't really feel like I was in World vs. World at all in this map, and I didn't really feel like I was in any kind of Silver Waste experience in this map either. While I do appreciate that there are certain elements of those maps you can definitely see in this new one, I tended to feel more like I did when I was in, say, Dragonfall, or a lot of the other new Living World releases, maybe Dragonstand as well to an extent. It's really not that dynamic of a map in terms of areas flipping blue and then red and actually holding onto territory, though a lot of that stuff is there. It kind of just feels like progress through the map in the same way that in Dragonfall you progress through the map like pushing through a lane, except this time you're not really pushing through a lane, you're kind of picking a different territory to go for. It was fun, and I did very much enjoy the boss fights that they implemented. The way the map functions is most of the time after you flip a territory, there'll be some kind of big encounter. And they were all well done. There were Char tanks to fight, just as I hoped there would be after we saw them in the Demolition Derby at the start of this saga. And the final battle in the meta, if you guys haven't played it yet, you really should. They do some fun stuff where you actually DPS a helicopter flying around. I'm not joking. And it kind of deposits a tank and picks it back up. Just lots of really cool mechanical interactions there. I feel like it was the open world map that the devs really focused on a lot with this release and impressed me more than anything else. I'm still not entirely sure I'm on board with the way ArenaNet operates now, in that they add like a million new mechanics. You know, every rung of a mastery has like a ton of little interactions it does. Every new map has a bunch of new interactables, and in this map there's like a parachute mechanic, and there's all the propaganda to destroy, and there's EMPs, and there's the barriers. There's just so much that they throw in there. With like thousands of loot sources, you play a little bit and then suddenly you got like 50 different chests that you open that give you 50 different types of crafting materials and currencies and all kinds of stuff. I'm not sure I'm on board with that. I think it's way too layered up to the game's detriment. I would rather they keep some of these kinds of mechanics around and have them recurrent through multiple maps. That's something I actually really liked about Bureau Marches, in that it was a map released in two halves, so that was something they could quite comfortably do. But I look back at, say, the previous Living World season and all the awesome innovations they did with like the Disturbance events and the Claw of Kraukatoric tornado mechanics and some of the innovations they made on how you get rewards and some of the stuff they did, say, with the Sun's Refuge. And none of those concepts have been brought back. I know some of them feel very much tied to the story of the time, but a lot of them could be repurposed, and the devs don't do it. They just throw a ton of new stuff every time. All that said, the added complexity obviously means that the map doesn't run out of steam too quick, and hopefully we can continue having fun and learning new things about the map as the weeks go on and we wait for the next release. Another observation about the patch in general that's really surprised me is, I have to say, at this point in Icebrood Saga, this feels like a Char story, not a Norn story. Now, I know the devs don't necessarily have to attribute one particular story to one particular race at all, even though they have certainly done that in the past. And I also know that when they first revealed the Icebrood Saga to us on stage, they did talk about how it was kind of both. But the amount of Norn influence in these releases is super minimal now. I mean, yeah, we had the Biora Marches stuff, cool. But the prologue of the saga really felt like a big Char thing. Last episode really felt like a big Char thing. And this episode certainly is entirely a Char thing. Which, don't get me wrong, I'm very happy with. I love the Char. I love their big themes of war and destruction and the stories that they could be going with them. It's just amazing for me to realize that the Icebrood saga dealing with Jormag at this point doesn't really feel like the Norn have had much of a look in. Yet, obviously. I'm sure we'll see that shift as time goes by. The last thing I would generally say about the patch is that the environments weren't really doing it for me. So this is the Verdant Cascades. For years, I've wanted to explore this area. Not just I've wanted to explore it in Guild Wars 2, but hell, explore it in general. In Guild Wars 1, when they expanded the world map and Eye of the North came out, they showed us this huge, amazing, forested looking area, and we got a tiny little brief glimpse into it in the Guild Wars 1 story. So finally, 250 years later, we're returning to the region. I think it's fair to say my hopes were really high. One of the main things I want for this game at all is the ability to explore new places and be wowed by what I see. So did the patch pull it off? To be honest, I don't think so. I'm pretty underwhelmed in general when the living world introduces new areas to play. You can tell that they're pulling at assets we've already seen and just trying to reconfigure them as much as possible. And this map is no exception. It's kind of the same as how Corner felt super similar to the rest of the Path of Fire locations, or Istan felt super similar to the rest of the Path of Fire locations back in the previous season. Here, I don't feel like I'm in a new region of the world. I mentioned a second ago that while playing the map, I couldn't help but constantly think of Dragonfall, and that was more from a mechanical perspective, but I'm probably being influenced just by these environments. I've seen these trees before, I've seen this lighthouse before, I've seen these buildings before, and that's a bit sad to me. Don't get me wrong, I know some of you in the comments will be frothing at the mouths now, because the map does look pretty. It is a visual treat. It's just that I think I personally value the experience of having something new more than having something pretty yet familiar. Obviously, people will fall in different ends of that spectrum. So let's talk about the story. There are a lot of great moments in the story here, and again, as I mentioned at the start, I will be spoiling you on this. This patch introduced the Frost Legion. So this is a fantastic idea. You can rewind the clock a few months, you can look back at the start of the Icebrood Saga and see that a lot of us were talking about the idea of a Frost Legion. It just worked too perfectly, and it's an idea that I'm glad ArenaNet ran with. They delayed the introduction of a Frost Legion just long enough, I think, that many of us weren't talking about anymore, and hopefully there was something of a surprise there. But if you ask me, this didn't need to be a surprise. A good story, even if people predict it, is still a good story. There's nothing taken away from leaning into something that was just straight up a nice idea, and I don't think the devs should be dissuaded from doing powerful story beats just because the community also anticipates them. The community's often anticipating them because they're good and they want to see it. The Legion was introduced at the end of the patch, so we really don't get to see their true strength just yet. There is a pretty awkward line where they nakedly state, "Oh, they are smarter than Icebrood." I guess we'll see how the devs can actually pay off on that. I love the effect as well. Looking back at the start of Icebrood Saga, we had that really beautiful image of the frozen storm and these enemies looming out of it. We kind of got the equivalent of that in the story to actually play for this episode, which was nice. I noticed that the portals the Frost Legion were coming out of were kind of visually being represented in the same way as those little portals teasing at the new Super Adventure Box world in the festival last month, so it's cool to see where the devs have reapplied that. Some other great moments were the reintroduction and honouring of the personal story stuff. So I talked a bit about the Ajax plot with last release, but this release did a ton of other stuff, specifically Char related. I mean, this is a big Char patch. So both Snarl and Galena are present in this patch. Talk a little bit about what they've been doing in recent years. I'm sure that many of you will have forgotten about Snarl and Galena, but they were personal story characters that were kind of stand-ins for Romeo and Juliet. I mean, really, that's what the story was. If you can't remember them, maybe go back, play it, or you can check out my personal story playthrough where I kind of show you every little moment that they appear, and you can follow them through for quite a long time. You also get a lot of interactions with your own warband if you're playing an actual Char character. So this was amazing because this is one of the most tangled, variable messes of possibilities the devs have in the game. If you guys have never played a Char, you start the game with your original warband all dying, except one member who you choose on the biography screen, and that can be one of like 6 different characters, so there's already a lot of variation to play with there. But then which warband you are actually in is also variable. So for example, there's a version of Dinky that's in Ash, and there's a version of Dinky that's in Blood, and there's a version of Dinky that's in Iron, and then the same for all the other characters, just based on your particular combo. And then the early chapters of the personal story as a Char actually involve you rebuilding your warband and making even more decisions about who you actually bring in. So to actually then, years later, pull at all of those and say this character is here now, this character is here now, and through phasing technology allow everyone to see all the relevant characters that they chose was super impressive for the devs, and I was astounded. In the footage you're watching, I'm actually playing a Sylvari just because I wanted to load in on a Necro, have an easy, smooth time with the release. And so, for what was a generic Blood Legion soldier to me, Legionnaire, to someone else might in fact be a cherished and prized member of their personal story that has now come back. I believe the devs also did a thing where several of these old characters have now defected to Bangar's Legions. Now, I haven't actually seen that myself just yet, having not played as a Char, but in principle I like the idea, because a big thrust of this story is, look, loads of Char are deciding to follow Bangar. Giving examples of real, seemingly reasonably minded Char that also follow suit, I think is quite a powerful thing to do. A disappointing thing to see characters act in ways you didn't expect, but I think also quite realistic and a fun idea that really drives home that, to a lot of Char, Bangar has a real point. Another impressive element of the story was how they brought back the Char written form, which we played with a little bit, I think, accessing the Ash Legion secret base at the start of the saga. But here you can actually read about this language, try to comprehend it, and then do actual genuine puzzle solving in the patch where you're actually asked to engage your brain. I mean, you're not really punished for failing or anything, but that was a really nice touch, and even reminded me a bit of the decrypting stuff from Eye of the North way back when. There are quite a few decisions you get to make in the story, go one way in a conversation or another, make a moral decision here or another. We've actually seen Icebrood Saga do that fairly consistently. I think it's quite well done, and they'll tie achievements to various things. So like at the very start, you get to mediate a large discussion, and if you manage to get through without weighing one way or the other too much, you get an achievement. It feels pretty good. And then finally, there is the warband we were playing as last patch, returning this one as antagonists. Now, if you listen to my video on the last patch, I mentioned how I wasn't quite sure how invested to be in these characters because I didn't know where the devs were going with them. Now that we have this release also, I have to say, it worked out really well, and there was definitely an added something there when I was in boss fights against characters that I actually kind of liked and really enjoyed playing alongside just very recently. That was all really awesome. So for all the positives that I've just mentioned, I must say as well, I was rather underwhelmed by the story on this release, unfortunately. And I know what you're instantly going to think, that I'm just being inobjective because what I've played is a version of the release without voice acting, and that's obviously tampered with my experience. But I really don't think it's that. There's lots of little minor things, and there's even some big stuff that I'm really uneasy about. So let's run through it. First of all, the patch opens with the war already underway. It's like we skipped a lot of beats in the story to suddenly be at this place where the conflict is happening. Last I remember from last release, and the one before, Bangar was actually going north to find the dragon, and I presumed many of his forces would be here with him. But we're just kind of randomly over at the Drizzlewood coast, and the conflict's been going on for ages. But, you know, in the space between the patches releasing, things were still escalating, but we never got to actually see it as a player. I just felt it wasn't that cohesive. Not a big issue. Another thing that kind of dragged the patch down was really all the instances you play for the main story are pretty simplistic on this one, especially compared with last release, which is what has probably spoiled me. But as I mentioned earlier, it really feels like they focused on the open world stuff more than anything else here. A lot of the story in this patch isn't really interesting mechanically. I mean, we have a bit of a stealth section with a special action that quickly kills people, but they don't do too much with it. There's a section where you're running after Ryland, but they don't really do too much with it. And then you're fleeing from artillery, but really it is just WASD. There's a disappointing boss fight against a prominent Char NPC in the middle of the release that feels, and I'm not exaggerating, exactly like a personal story caliber boss fight, where it's a character that has way too few animations, that uses them too slowly, and is dead in a couple of hits anyway. And for the rest of the patch, you're running around in the open worlds, interacting with things just as you would do while participating in the meta, so they're kind of doing that double dip thing, which I personally have no problems with, but does further what I'm saying, that really the story itself, this patch, doesn't have you do too much. And then we have what's much more important to me, the story itself. So suddenly in this release, it's not just that the Char are a civil war now, it's that we're on a quest to save the Char. And the idea being, I guess, that if the Char continue fighting, then they'll destroy themselves, and this is some apocalyptic event for them. And this is, you know, the battle for their very essence. If they keep up this bloodshed, they will lose too many men, they will destroy their economy, they will waste time and energy they should be spending on the dragons, and as a people, they will fail. Much as, say, the Jotun before them, or the last time they lost all their territory. And the Char desperately need to change, else they're goners. And I get the writer's impulse to do this. They want the story to have stakes, and I guess they feel the Elder Dragon threat isn't enough. But, unfortunately, I don't buy what they're offering up here. The Char haven't been fighting one another for long enough to have escalated to this point. So every time the release says, oh, we need to save the Char, or tries to convince me that they're particularly vulnerable, it either comes out as melodramatic nonsense, or it actually just makes the Char look really weak. Like, they're not these badasses that have got all this territory, much of which we didn't get to play before the Icebreed Saga. Instead, they're like these weak little kitty things that as soon as they have a little bit of internal strife, they go for a few conflicts and now they're on the edge of not being able to make it out, and every Char life is precious. I don't think this follows. Conflict isn't something that special to the Char. This is a species who for hundreds of years have promoted themselves through the ranks through the assassination of their superiors. They are built on conflict. I don't like this. I don't think the Char are cool if you're painting them as weak all the time. You know what made the Char interesting as a function of this setting? The fact that they really didn't see every life as precious. They were cutthroat, but yet successful, and that's interesting to try to justify and explore. But the patches aren't interested in telling these kinds of stories. I hate to admit it, but multiple times playing this release, all that went through my brain was, this is lame. And unfortunately, this patch in this story is obsessed with this idea of saving the Char. And not just in terms of manpower and strength, but like saving the soul of the Char. They're going for storylines about winning the war, but at what cost? What is truly justified in times of bloodshed? Blah, blah, blah. I feel like the game has become obsessed with these themes of like virtue that once upon a time were only really being explored through like the Centaurs or the Sylvari, and now it's all that the Tyrian setting is interested in. It gets cliche, it gets tropey, it gets boring after a while. Now sure, there is a character that still kind of celebrates and indulges in those more violent cutthroat elements of this race, and that's Smolder, who is ludicrously ruthless in this patch. Like, you have to appreciate that this episode starts with us watching Smolder assassinate his own men for defecting. Now that, to me, is the Char, and I do appreciate it's right here in this release. The devs haven't forgotten those sides of them, and Bangar 2 is a beautiful expression of that stuff. I even love that as far as this patch is concerned, a patch that really plays with all the Imperators and many elements of the Legions, including the reforming Flame Legion. They make Smolder, of all of them, Smolder is the real badass that's making these super tough, hard decisions on a whim. Because Smolder really, before this release, felt more like the more progressively minded Char. This was the guy that actually pushed for the peace treaty with the humans and actually managed to settle the conflicts at Ebonhawk. And this was the guy that was more of the out-of-the-box thinker. And yet, in this release, we're seeing these really, really gruesome elements to him. I don't necessarily dislike that. I think that, in theory, could actually round him out in a lot of ways and make him all the more compelling for it. The problem is that Smolder isn't just being shown to have these sides to him, but he's basically being framed as a monstrous villain now. After we see him shooting his own soldiers for defecting, we then have to spend the rest of the patch enduring how Rytlock and all the other Char, Blood Legion Char included, see how wrong this is and that no, he really shouldn't think this way. And fine, I get it. Some of you guys love the character transformation Rytlock has gone through. Characters change, that's often a sign of good writing, and I'm sure that many of you love that he's changed from a wisecracking badass to a bullied cub that has been rounded out and softened by the various civilizations he's interacted with since joining Destiny's Edge. But it's not just Rytlock. All the other ostensibly good Char in this patch seem just as soft as him, and aside from like the political intrigue and wondering if Ash is maybe playing both sides, there's no edge. The game seems pretty aware that it's doing this. There is a nice scene where Ephraim of the Flame Legion is butting heads with Smolder, who expected more backbone from these once badasses, but nothing comes from it. They just softly lampshade the thing and hope that's enough. There's no edge except in Smolder, who this game is beating you over the head with disliking. They don't round him out in this release, they kind of assassinate him. Like, Smolder is a totally different character now. A bully that should be avoided at all costs, even if you can still sort of interpret what he's doing as being the Char way. And he's not even consistent. At the start of the release, he's shooting people for defecting, and yet at the end of the meta, all of the Imperators are roaring in agreement that no, we must tend to all the wounded, not just our allies, but all the enemies too must be nursed back to health. Yeah, so I guess we changed our mind on that one, did we? It's not all bad though. I personally thought, and I was pretty convinced of this, as I played through the patch, that they were making Smolder into a complete arsehole and a different character so that they could justify killing him at the end of the release. But that didn't happen. Smolder is still around and will continue to be an influence in upcoming releases. The devs have an opportunity here to vindicate Smolder and show that a lot of the hard and difficult decisions he's made actually were to the Char's benefit in the end, and maybe they'll give us an interesting story here about making difficult decisions in war, rather than all that bland, boring, preachy stuff that this patch seems to be so suddenly interested in. So that's really the big topic for me. There are maybe some other nitpicks or things for you guys to be aware about as you go in. Yes, I mentioned the Frost Legion was introduced this episode, and that is a great thing. I'm interested to see what they do. But in terms of actually progressing the plot and moving Tyria forwards, this was actually a fairly hands-off patch without too much progression into the later stages. Part of me is actually wondering now if they're shifting the gears down a bit, because Icebrood Saga has got a lot of real-life time to span before the next Canthan expansion. So maybe they want to ease up a bit. And I could be totally wrong. The other thing I would note is I love that Logan reappeared in this episode, and Kazmir to an extent as well. But he doesn't really do anything cool. I'm still waiting for him to have a big, awesome moment in that shiny new armor he's got. Again, these were just my first impressions. I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. I do 100% acknowledge and see the fact that the devs are bringing up these interesting areas of subject material, which is great, and I applaud that. It's just how they're framing them that is kind of grating me at the moment. But there you have it. That is No Quarter. A rather ironic title, I would say, given that discussion we just had now. Hope you guys enjoyed hearing my take on this. I know some of you are asking me to like fully do a playthrough of this early before my Let's Play gets there and voice act for you. I'm not sure I'm too interested in that just because of the logistics of how all the dialogue overlaps in the open world and so forth. But you can continue to give me your thoughts down in the comments below. Cheers, everyone. Hope you're having a great time, and I'll see you next time.